Hi everyone, hope you're all well. And we're in Winchelsea, and this is the old Strand Gate at Winchelsea. And it's a lovely old piece of medieval structure, of course, but has an interesting link to my family. In medieval times, on my dad's side of the family, we had knights and gentry, really, you'd call them. And one of them was executed here, and his head stuck up on a spike on this gate. Now, I wasn't planning on filming this one, but I've got round to it. Unfortunately, my family tree is indoors and I can't remember all the details, so this is the first bit of filming of it. The rest of it you'll see when I get back home, get the family tree out and can get all his details and everything. But yeah, his head was cut off. He basically was found guilty of treason, decapitated here. His head was stuck up on the town gate here. Because he was a knight and of a gentry family, some kind of mercy was given in that, although his head had to be stuck up here, they gave permission for his body to be buried within the church. So, we'll have a little walk around to this structure. Let's go down and take a closer look, shall we? There once would have been gates or portcullises on this. There's an information board. The Strand Gate. The Strand Gate is one of 3 surviving medieval gates of Winchelsea, built circa 1300. After the building of New Winchelsea, it stands at the top of Strand Hill following a steep climb from the former harbour at the bottom. Just get a bit closer. In its day, the harbour was bustling with commercial and military shipping, bringing goods to important trading port of Winchelsea, providing troop transport to the King's soldiers. When built, it was a third higher than it is today. Incorporated 2 portcullises and was a porter's lodge inside in the north-eastern tower, and a room with a portcullis and winding gear at the first floor. As with other medieval buildings, the Strand Gate would have been rendered white and would have looked a magnificent sight from the sea. The Strand Gate is owned and maintained by the Corporation of Winchelsea. The corporation acknowledges the support and grant from English Heritage in 2008 towards refurbishment works. Potlock holes. And you get some amazing views, because you have to remember, back in medieval times, the sea came in this far. And there would have been a port here at one point. Potlock holes, and that's how they built them. Basically the wooden beams for medieval scaffolding would have gone in this. Rendered over, they saw the beams off level, render it over, and after time the render comes off, the beams would have worn away or rotted away and leaving you with potlock holes. If we walk around here, you can see where the portcullis would once have gone, and you can go inside this room, the porter's lodge. Hope you all found this part of the story interesting, and as I say, for the rest of the telling of our story, you'll have to wait till I get back home to London and get all the correct details. My family tree goes back to the 1000s, you see, so it's very, very difficult to remember everyone and everything. So, you'll join me for the next part of the video back in London. And as said, we would have to wait till I get back to London for the second part of the telling of our story, because I needed to get the blue box out and the family tree. There's so much information that even I, who know a lot of this information, forget it, particularly going back this far. But the couple we're particularly interested in are my 20 times great-grandparents, Thomas Colepeper. You see here the names being spelt Colepepper. Later generations of the family would go on to spell it Culpepper. And for any of those of you who are into your Tudor history are wondering, yes, Thomas Colepeper, the servant of Henry VIII that was executed for having an affair with Henry VIII's wife, is a descendant of these people. So it's these two here, that's their son, my direct grandfather link. But the Thomas Colepeper that was executed in Henry VIII's time is descended from this man, who's the brother of my 19 times great-grandfather. So this family has seen two executed traitors, unfortunately. But there we are. Thomas Colepeper, born in 1260 in Bayhall in Kent or Sussex. He died in 1321, was executed at Winchelsea for treason. His occupation was the governor of Winchelsea. He married in about 1286 in London, in Middlesex, and his wife was Margery Bayhall. She was born circa 1270 in Bayhall, Kent/Sussex, and she died after 1321. This is my information that I've got here, in London. And I've had some very kind help from someone who works in Winchelsea Museum, and now have quite a few more details about this family. I now know that Thomas here, like his father and grandfather before him, was also a knight, so I have to update this page soon and put Sir Thomas Colepeper, KNT. And we now know that Margery, his wife, died after 1323. So that's them. And had he not been executed, he would have received a grave like this. This is another ancestor of mine. The families married into each other, as most gentry families did in those days. And this is Sir William and Lady Juliana de Huddershill. And this is Sir William's grave. He was a knight who went on the Crusades. And Sir Thomas, really, as an executed traitor, was lucky to receive any kind of grave at all. And that's what we're going to go into and discuss now, more events of his life and how his head come to be stuck up on a spike on Winchelsea Town Gate. And 4 generations of my Colepeper ancestors lived through the reigns of these 3 kings, and each in various ways or other served these 3 kings. That's King Henry III, who we see here, and he reigned from 1216 to 1272 and is one of England's longest reigning monarchs. King Edward I, a very famous king or infamous, shall we say as well, for various reasons or other, and he reigned from 1272 to 1307. And then here we have his son, King Edward II, who is the main protagonist in our story, really, with my executed ancestor and with his wife as well. And he reigned from 1307 to 1327. He's often described as a very vainglorious man and quite an ineffectual king. Unlike his father and grandfather, he was not a great people person in many ways. They knew how to work with their lords and barons and knights. This one exacted his own will, and everyone was expected to obey it, and they didn't. He was deposed and he was murdered in Berkeley Castle. Some of the accounts say by having a red-hot iron poker shoved up his backside. Some of the accounts say that the screams could be heard from half a mile away, and other accounts say that he was suffocated or pressed to death. Either way, he was murdered. And this is a revised family tree, just for your purposes, anyone that may be interested. You've got the 4 generations of those family that served those 3 kings. Sir John Colepeper, born in 1303, and he died after 1370. Then you've got his parents, who are our 2 main characters in this story. His executed father, Sir Thomas Colepeper Jr., born in 1260 and executed in 1321 at Winchelsea, of course. And his wife, Margery Colepeper, born circa 1270, and we now know that she died after 1323 in London. And then you've got Sir Thomas Jr.'s father, Sir Thomas Colepeper Sr. He was born in 1230 and died after 1309, also in London. And in those days, there were no such thing as parish registers. They didn't come along until 1538. So we only know that he died after 1309 in London because he wrote his will in 1309. So for that era, he was a very old man indeed, being 79 plus years of age, which was quite an achievement in those days. And then you've got his father, Sir John Colepeper, born in 1200, and he died after 1230. Sir Thomas Colepeper Sr., being marked with the arrow now, in the reign of King Edward II, when his son Thomas and Margery, his wife, there being marked with the arrow now, purchased of him 50 acres of land in Falston. Thomas Sr. was a fairly old man, and although indicated in 1305 with his son Thomas for stealing goods from the vicar of Ringmer, we can hardly believe that he took any active part in this matter, he then being a man of approximately 75 years old. This is all new information that John from Winchelsea kindly sent me, and I'm very, very grateful for it. Also, it's for this reason that it is not probable that Thomas Sr. was porter or janitor to Leeds Castle in 1292. It was more likely his son of the same name, our executed ancestor, and this is new information to me because I didn't know that he was a porter or janitor of Leeds Castle either, so this is new and interesting information to me. This is the Colepeper coat of arms, and as a knight they would have had to have a coat of arms, of course. And portraiture in those days, other than illuminated documents, and unless you were ultimately wealthy like a king or a member of the royal family, didn't exist. You might see a funerary monument, like with the one I showed you in the family tree, but portraiture just didn't exist, so we'll never see the faces of my ancestors. But this is a depiction of a knight in the 14th century. What a knight would have looked like, how he would have dressed. And this is a knight going on pilgrimage. And nearly everyone in that era went on pilgrimage, from knights to peasants. And it was a bad lord indeed that would deny his peasant to go on pilgrimage. So we know with certainty that my ancestors would have gone on pilgrimages. So that's a little interesting insight, and what they may well have looked like. How they would have dressed anyway. And this is Leeds Castle, of which my ancestor was porter or janitor, and this is it nowadays, of course. Of the heirs of Sir Thomas Colepeper Sr., there was besides his son Thomas and Walter, who were both executed, and this is new information as well, because Walter, who I pointed out, who is the ancestor of Thomas Colepeper, who was executed in the reign of Henry VIII, Walter was also executed as well, which I didn't know, and he was executed for denying entry to York Castle to the Queen. So that's another interesting insight. Who were both executed. Another son, John, and there was doubtless another son named Nicholas. All four of his sons were implicated in the Earl of Lancaster's rebellion, but John and Nicholas evidently in a lesser degree than Thomas and Walter. There was an order issued in 1322 to the Sheriff of York to receive John Colepeper and others into the custody of York Castle. John Colepeper took part in the Battle of Boroughbridge, and this is a depiction of that from an illuminated manuscript. And this is the Earl of Lancaster, and his head was severed by 2 or 3 blows from a sword, and that was granted as a mercy rather than being hanged, drawn and quartered. This man, whom my ancestors sided with, he simply had his head smitten off, as the records tell us. These are knights from that era going about their knightly business, and when you think of a knight you think of chivalry and a romantic image. It wasn't really like that. They were quite brutal people and had to do some pretty brutal and nasty things. And I think myself it would be better to be a peasant in those days than to be a knight. You went under the radar, and unless you had a real sadistic arsehole for a lord, you would have pretty much lived a peaceful life and been left alone. Weaver, in his Ancient Funerary Monuments, speaks of Sir Thomas Colepeper siding with the Earl of Lancaster and being hanged, drawn and quartered at Winchelsea. And this is a depiction from the 14th century from a manuscript of a man being hanged, drawn and quartered. And that nasty process involved you being, at this period, tied up to a ladder. They'd cut your genitals off, they'd be burned in the fire before you, then your stomach could be opened, your bowels would be taken out, they would be burned. At this period, I mean, for the poor beggars, they were alive and were at the point of dying. And then the quartering came with the mercy blow, where they'd cut your head off and then they'd quarter the body. In many cases, those quartered parts were sent to various parts of the kingdom and put up on spikes or in prominent places to act as a warning to other people not to do the same thing. In my ancestor's case, Thomas Jr., who was hanged, drawn and quartered at Winchelsea, with an order that his head be put up on the town gate, but of the king's mercy, the quartered parts of his body were allowed to be buried in Winchelsea, which they were. And this is a depiction of spiked heads up on London Bridge, so you can very much imagine this kind of scene at Winchelsea Town Gate with my ancestor's head stuck up on a spike. And the custom in Winchelsea was to, at the Strand Gate, to throw the heads into the sea when they had been up for an appropriate length of time. There are some rumours, and this happened with Thomas More, that his daughter had bribed the headkeeper, the headman of London Bridge, and she got his head, and apparently kept it with her all her life and is buried with her. Whether Lady Margery was able to do such a thing, I do not know. It's more than likely that my ancestor's head was tossed into the sea. And my ancestor, as I say, his quartered parts of his body, missing his head, were buried in the church of St Thomas the Martyr in Winchelsea, under a plain black stone, which you see here. When the Victorians repaired Winchelsea Church in the 1850s, a lot of repairs were needed to the floor, and they found the mutilated remains of Thomas Colepeper Jr. under this plain black stone. The body had been wrapped and shrouded and clapped in lead, buried decently but modestly. Clapped in lead, you may be thinking, what on earth's that? It's basically where a sheet of lead would be moulded round your body and you'd be soldered into it. This is an anthropoidal lead coffin. This is not my ancestor's one. This is basically to give you a description of how he would have been buried. He was buried modestly yet decently, and above his body, in the same grave, were found the skeletal remains of a female, believed to have been of mature years, with nearly all her teeth missing. Those remains are no doubt those of Thomas Jr.'s wife, Lady Margery Colepeper. Around her remains were found the traces, much degraded, of a wooden coffin. So her husband was buried in this manner, and John tells me it's a mark of the family's wealth that Lady Margery, who doubtless would have arranged this, was able to have her husband clapped in lead and buried under such a stone. Although plain, it's more than most executed traitors were given. And the fact that she herself was buried in a lead coffin, when most people in those days were simply shrouded and buried in their shroud, or their winding sheet as it's called. And this depiction gives us an image kind of what Lady Margery would have dressed like or looked like. And this is a lady's dress of the 14th century, a knight's wife wearing a fine dress and a wimple. Women in those days had to keep their hair covered. It was a woman's glory and should only be seen by her husband and God. And it's under that plain black stone that my ancestor and his wife still lie resting, surrounded by the very fine tombs. Any of you that saw my video of Winchelsea Church, the other knights' tombs, had Thomas not been executed, he would have had pretty much a tomb like that. They had the money for it, but they were keeping a low profile, and the order given was that he could be buried, but it had to be done modestly but decently, and this is what he got. And as the Victorian description said, there were no traces of an inscription on this stone or monumental brasses. Their initials may have been put on it. There may have been an inscription for Lady Margery, but they found no trace of it, and it is pretty much a plain black stone. But it's interesting to have it finally confirmed. I mean, I knew from other information that I'd found over the years that this was likely their burial place, but I had no idea about the Victorians finding his body in an anthropoidal coffin. That's very interesting. And Lady Margery as well. And another indicator, John from Winchelsea said to me, as to their wealth, was the fact that Lady Margery was missing most of her teeth. It shows that the family were wealthy enough to have access to sugary sweet foods in those days, and many people from the 13th and 14th century, including peasants, had pretty good teeth. When their skeletons are excavated, their teeth compared to those in later generations of particularly the 18th and 19th century are in pretty good shape, because most people didn't have access to sugary foods in those days. And that, my friends, is how my ancestor came to be executed in Winchelsea Town. A lot of the executions that took place in those days would have taken place in prominent places, so likely near a church or a prominent building in those days. The church being right next to the court hall. The court hall, as John tells me, is 99% certain that he would have been put on trial in there, taken from there, and likely executed either outside the church or possibly by the town gate. And it's on this Strand gate into Winchelsea that my ancestor's head would have been stuck up on a spike. And although that's the end of the story of my ancestor, Sir Thomas Colepeper Jr., whose life was brutally ended in this way, it's not quite the end of our story. What you have to remember in those days is, as an executed traitor, all his property and lands and holdings, which were quite vast, upon his execution would have become the property of the crown. Everything would have been confiscated, leaving Sir Thomas's widow not only a widow, but basically with nothing. And a very interesting event occurred. Still in the reign of King Edward II, who we see here. Just 1 year after her husband's execution, Sir Thomas's wife, Lady Margery, who must have been a very feisty and tenacious lady, she went to what was called the Westminster Palace, where the old Parliament was kept and held, and where a lot of the legal dealings of the day took place. And a document exists that states the Lady Margery Colepeper did go before His Majesty the King and did plead of mercy. Basically what she was after was for the King to override the decision and return the lands to her. And she took a great risk doing this, because Edward II wasn't the nicest of men. He could have turned nasty with her and taken his anger out on her. Luckily she played her hand and it worked, because the King did override his decision and he returned everything to her except the land holdings at Winchelsea. The land holdings included lands in Rye, Bay Hall, and other various lands and holdings in Kent and Sussex, and also in London. And the document, it was looked into by the King's people, and their findings were obviously given to the King. And as John said to me, we're never going to know this, but did they find that Sir Thomas Jr.'s involvement in the rebellion wasn't as much as they may have thought it was? Or did the King just take pity on this woman, who at the time would have been in her mid-50s, and return the lands to her? The document itself was dated this feast day of St. Bartholomew in the 15th year of our reign, given under our hand and seal at the Westminster, and that dates the document till the 24th of August 1322, just 1 year after her husband's execution. And it's an interesting thought to think of this tenacious little lady, who must have been quite frightened doing this, going before the King and pleading mercy, because she obviously wanted to pass on things to her children which had been taken away from them. And some of the lands, particularly those of Bay Hall, were the lands that she had brought into the marriage with her. So they were returned. And I often think of what this lady, my 20 times great-grandmother, would make of my great-grandmother, her 17 times great-granddaughter. I mean, Lady Margery was a very powerful and died a very rich lady. And my great-grandmother, who was Canning Town born and bred, and whose occupations were, in her younger days, a jam boiler, and in her older days, a ship scrubber, a term that my nan absolutely detested because of the scrubber bit, but her job was basically to, when the ships came into the docks and they were emptied out, to go into them with other ladies and scrub them from top to bottom. What would these two ladies have thought of each other? And I bet my great-grandmother would have been very shocked to know that she was descended from such people. It's a thought I've had many times, and particularly recently with all this new information coming in. And that is the story of Sir Thomas and Lady Margery Colepeper, who lie resting together in this grave. Lady Margery wrote her own will in 1323, and an interesting thing is, in those days, women didn't hold much power or autonomy. Before they married, they were the property of their fathers. When they married, the woman and everything she brought into the marriage with her became the property of her husband. So this widowed lady would have become upon the decree of the king returning everything to her, a very rich widow, and she would have enjoyed a degree of autonomy, which was not unheard of, but relatively unusual for the time. And she wrote her own will in 1323, dividing what she had between her children. Most of the wealth and lands and everything went to her 3 sons: Sir John Colepeper, my direct grandfather ancestor, Walter Colepeper, his brother, and Richard Colepeper, his brother, and with an agreement that these 3 sons were to pay an annual sum to their sister, Margaret Colepeper. And it's in London that Lady Margery died, so, as John said, another hint to the family's wealth was the fact that they managed to get her body all the way from London to Winchelsea to be buried with her husband. She must have loved him a very great deal. And that's the story of my Colepeper ancestors, their grave in the church here of St Thomas the Martyr, and a sight that must have been absolutely awful to our family to see their husband and father's head stuck up on a spike, and everyone knowing that he'd died a traitor. I hope you all found this interesting, and thank you for watching.